"Get out of my house by Friday," my daughter-in-law said, standing in the doorway of the living room I had helped decorate nearly 30 years ago. Her voice was calm, almost cheerful. That was the part that hurt the most. Cruelty is easier to understand when it arrives with anger. But when it comes wrapped in a smile, it leaves a different kind of wound. My name is Helen Parker. I am 72 years old, and 3 weeks after burying my husband, I found myself being told to leave the only home I had ever truly known. I remember the afternoon clearly. The October sunlight filtered through the large front windows, casting long golden rectangles across the hardwood floors. The same floors Robert and I had saved for years to install. The same floors our son Jason had crawled across as a toddler. I sat quietly in Robert's favorite armchair, my hands folded in my lap. Across from me stood Jason and Olivia. My son avoided looking directly at me. Olivia had no such difficulty. "It's time to move forward," she said. "This house is too much for you now." I looked at Jason. I waited for him to say something. Anything. A joke. An objection. A simple "Mom, that's not what we mean." Instead, he shifted his weight and stared at the family photographs lining the mantel. "Mom," he finally said, "Olivia's right. Maintaining a place this size isn't practical anymore." Practical. It was amazing how often people used that word when they wanted something that belonged to someone else. The grandfather clock ticked softly in the corner. Outside, a lawn mower hummed somewhere down the street. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary moments. Yet everything felt different, as if I had somehow stepped into a version of my life that no longer belonged to me. "Where exactly am I supposed to go?" I asked. Olivia crossed her arms. "There are plenty of nice senior apartments nearby." Senior apartments. The phrase landed harder than I expected. Not because there was anything wrong with such places, but because of how quickly she had decided my future without ever asking what I wanted. Jason finally looked at me. For a brief moment, I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Guilt perhaps, or uncertainty. Then it vanished. "You'll be happier there," he said. "Less responsibility." I nodded slowly. I could have argued. I could have reminded him that I paid property taxes for years, that I had sacrificed vacations, new cars, and countless luxuries to help build our family's life. I could have listed every birthday party, every school fundraiser, every late-night emergency I had handled while raising him. But something inside me had gone strangely calm. Maybe grief had exhausted all my energy for fighting. Or maybe I simply wanted to see how far they were willing to go. Olivia smiled when she noticed my silence. "I'm glad you understand." Understand. Another interesting word. I rose from the chair and walked upstairs. My bedroom still smelled faintly like Robert's aftershave. His reading glasses sat untouched on the nightstand. His navy sweater remained draped over the foot of the bed exactly where he had left it. I opened the closet and pulled out an old suitcase. The zipper sounded louder than it should have. Downstairs, I could hear Olivia speaking excitedly. Her voice carried through the vents. "Once everything is settled, we can finally start making changes." Changes. I paused. Then I heard another sound. Papers rustling. A drawer opening. Olivia's voice dropped lower, but not low enough. "Where's that folder?" she asked. Jason answered something I couldn't quite hear. More shuffling followed. I stepped toward the hallway and listened. My heart beat a little faster. There was something in her tone. Not excitement. Not relief. Urgency. As if she were searching for something important. Something she expected to find. I looked down at the suitcase in my hand. Then toward the stairs. And for the first time since Robert's funeral, a single thought pushed through the fog of grief. Maybe this wasn't only about getting me out of the house. Maybe they were looking for something else. That night, I packed very little. A few sweaters. 2 pairs of shoes. My medications. The framed photograph of Robert and me standing beside the maple tree we planted during our first spring in the house. Everything else stayed where it had always been. I sat on the edge of the bed long after sunset, listening to the familiar sounds of the home settling around me. The faint creak in the hallway. The hum of the refrigerator downstairs. The distant bark of a neighbor's dog. For 34 years those sounds had meant comfort. Now they felt like a farewell. Around 10 o'clock, I finally stood and walked toward the window. The backyard looked silver beneath the moonlight. Robert had spent countless weekends tending that lawn. He used to joke that the grass received better care than he did. The memory made me smile for the first time in days. Then my eyes drifted toward the driveway. Olivia's car was still there. So was Jason's. I noticed movement through the downstairs windows. They were not relaxing for the evening. They were searching. Back and forth they moved between rooms carrying folders, opening drawers, checking cabinets. I watched quietly from the darkness. Earlier, I might have convinced myself that I was imagining things. Not anymore. Something had changed. The urgency in their behavior was impossible to ignore. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside my bedroom. The door remained closed, but shadows moved beneath it. Then silence. A moment later, I heard the doorknob turn gently. Whoever stood outside seemed surprised to find it locked. The handle stopped moving. Several seconds passed before the footsteps retreated down the hall. I did not sleep much after that. The next morning I woke before sunrise. The house felt strangely empty despite everyone being under the same roof. I carried my suitcase downstairs. Olivia was already in the kitchen. She stood at the counter with a cup of coffee and her phone. She looked up and offered a smile that never reached her eyes. "Good morning, Helen," she said. "Did you sleep well?" "Well enough," I replied. Her gaze immediately shifted to the suitcase. Not to me, to the suitcase, as if confirming that events were proceeding according to schedule. Jason entered moments later. He looked exhausted. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes. He poured himself coffee without speaking. Nobody mentioned Robert. Nobody mentioned the funeral that had taken place less than a month earlier. Instead, Olivia began discussing paint colors for the guest room. My room. She spoke as though the decision had already been made. I listened quietly. The more she talked, the more certain I became that this was not simply about creating space. There was something else driving her. Something larger. After breakfast, I carried my suitcase to the front door. Olivia walked me outside. Jason remained in the kitchen. He did not even come to the porch. The October air felt cool against my face. Olivia folded her arms and glanced toward the street. Then she said something that made my stomach tighten. "I am sure everything will work out once the paperwork is finalized." Paperwork. The word lingered in my mind. I looked at her carefully. "What paperwork?" I asked. For the briefest moment, her expression changed. "Not much. Just enough." Then the smile returned. "Nothing important," she said. But as I stepped toward the waiting taxi, I noticed her hand gripping a thick manila folder against her side. And suddenly I was certain that whatever they had been searching for, they had not found it yet. The taxi dropped me at a small extended-stay hotel about 15 minutes from the house. It was not luxurious, but it was clean, quiet, and far enough away to give me space to think. My room overlooked a parking lot and a row of maple trees that had already begun turning red and gold. I placed my suitcase beside the bed and sat down in the armchair near the window. For the first time in weeks, nobody was telling me what to do. Nobody was watching me. Nobody was waiting for me to leave. The silence felt unfamiliar. I spent most of that afternoon thinking about Olivia's words. Not the cruel ones. Those no longer surprised me. It was the comment about paperwork that stayed with me. The way she had tightened her grip on the folder. The brief flash of panic when I asked a simple question. Something was wrong. I could feel it. Late that evening, I opened my purse and began sorting through old documents. Insurance cards, medical records, receipts, notes from the funeral home. I was not searching for anything specific. I simply needed something to occupy my mind. As I worked, I found a folded piece of paper tucked inside an envelope. It was a handwritten note from Robert. The date at the top showed it had been written almost 2 years earlier. His handwriting was steady and familiar. Reading it felt like hearing his voice again. Most of the note was ordinary. Reminders about a doctor appointment, a grocery list, a few jokes he knew would make me smile. But near the bottom was a sentence that caught my attention. "If anything ever happens to me, promise you will speak to Michael before signing anything." I read the line twice. Then a third time. Michael. Attorney Michael Grant. Our family lawyer. Robert had worked with him for more than 20 years. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the paper. Why would Robert write that? He had never been dramatic, never secretive. If he left a warning, there was a reason. The next morning I called Michael's office. The receptionist recognized my name immediately and transferred me to his direct line. "Helen," he said warmly, "I have been hoping you would call." Those words sent a chill through me. "Hoping?" I asked. There was a brief pause. "I think we should meet in person," he said carefully. "There are some things we need to discuss." We arranged to meet the following afternoon. After the call ended, I sat quietly for several minutes. Outside, rain tapped softly against the window. Cars moved through the parking lot below. Everything appeared normal. Yet I could not shake the feeling that I was standing at the edge of something important. The next day I arrived at Michael's office 10 minutes early. The building looked exactly as I remembered. Dark brick exterior, polished wood reception desk, framed photographs lining the hallway. Michael greeted me personally and led me into his office. He looked older than I remembered, more tired. Once the door closed, he folded his hands on the desk and studied me for a moment. "Helen," he said gently, "before we begin, I need to ask you something." My stomach tightened. Of course. He opened a file and removed several documents. Then he looked directly into my eyes. "Have you signed any property transfer forms since Robert passed away?" I shook my head immediately. "No." Michael nodded slowly. Not relieved, not surprised. Almost as though my answer confirmed something he already suspected. Then he turned the first document toward me, and what I saw at the top of the page made my heart stop. I stared at the document for several seconds before I fully understood what I was seeing. My name was there, not buried in fine print, not listed as a beneficiary. It appeared directly beneath Robert's as a legal owner of the property. Helen Parker and Robert Parker, joint owners. I looked up at Michael. "What does this mean?" My voice sounded smaller than I intended. He leaned back in his chair. "It means the house belongs to you." The room seemed unusually quiet. I glanced back down at the page. The familiar address sat near the top. The house. The front porch where Robert drank coffee every morning. The dining room where we celebrated birthdays and holidays. The kitchen where I taught Jason how to bake cookies when he was 7 years old. All of it. Still mine. Michael opened another folder. Several years ago, Robert insisted on restructuring ownership. He wanted to make certain you would always be protected. I felt a lump form in my throat. Even now, months after losing him, Robert was somehow still looking after me. Michael slid another document across the desk. "There is more." I studied the page carefully. It contained records from the county property office, transfer requests, ownership inquiries, notes regarding recent attempts to access property information. The dates immediately caught my attention. Most were recent, very recent. Some had occurred only days after Robert's funeral. I felt a chill. "Who requested these?" I asked quietly. Michael hesitated. Then he answered. "Jason contacted the office twice. Olivia once." I looked away. Outside the office window, people moved along the sidewalk carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Ordinary lives. Ordinary afternoons. Yet my entire understanding of the past few weeks was shifting. The pressure to leave. The discussions about senior apartments. The searching. The mysterious folder. Suddenly, everything seemed connected. "They thought the house belonged to Jason," I said. Michael slowly shook his head. "No, Helen. Based on these records, I believe they were trying to find out whether it belonged to Jason." That distinction mattered. One was ignorance. The other was investigation. I folded my hands tightly together. Images from recent weeks returned one after another. Olivia discussing renovations. Jason talking about practicality. The late-night searches. The locked doorknob outside my bedroom. None of it felt accidental anymore. Michael studied my expression. "There is something else you should know." My stomach tightened again. He reached into a drawer and removed a sealed envelope. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. Across the front, written in Robert's unmistakable handwriting, were 4 simple words. "For Helen, if necessary." My eyes immediately filled with tears. Michael placed the envelope in front of me, but did not open it. "Robert left instructions," he said. "Very specific instructions. He told me this was only to be delivered if anyone ever attempted to pressure you regarding the house." For a moment I could not speak. I simply stared at the envelope. Robert had anticipated something. Maybe not every detail. Maybe not Olivia. Maybe not Jason. But enough to prepare. Enough to leave a safeguard behind. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the letter. Then my phone vibrated on the desk. The screen lit up with a text message from Jason. It was the first message he had sent since I left. I opened it. The words were short, almost casual, but they immediately made my heart race. "Mom, Olivia found something in Dad's old files. We need to talk as soon as possible." I stared at Jason's message for a long moment before setting the phone face down on Michael's desk. The timing was impossible to ignore. For weeks they had pushed me toward the door. For weeks they had treated me as though my future had already been decided. Now suddenly they wanted to talk. Michael watched me carefully. "You do not have to answer right away," he said. I nodded. He was right. For the first time since Robert's funeral, I did not have to react to someone else's demands. The realization felt strangely powerful. I picked up the sealed envelope Robert had left behind and carefully opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. The paper carried the familiar scent of his study, as though it had been waiting all these years for this exact moment. I unfolded it slowly. The first line immediately brought tears to my eyes. My dear Helen, if you are reading this, something has happened that worried me for a very long time. I swallowed hard and continued. Robert explained that several years earlier he had noticed changes in family dynamics that troubled him. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just small moments. Conversations that stopped when he entered a room. Questions about assets that seemed unusually specific. Discussions about the future that always focused on property rather than people. He wrote that he never wanted to create conflict, but he also refused to leave me vulnerable. That was why he had arranged ownership the way he did. That was why he had left copies of every important document with Michael. By the time I reached the final page, my hands were trembling. The last sentence was simple. Trust facts, not pressure. And remember that this house was built to be your home too. I carefully folded the letter and placed it back into the envelope. For several minutes, neither Michael nor I spoke. Finally, I picked up my phone and opened Jason's message again. This time I replied with only 4 words. What did she find? His response arrived less than a minute later. Dad's old property folder. I stared at the screen. Property folder. The missing folder. The one I had overheard them searching for. My pulse quickened. Another message followed immediately. Can we meet tomorrow? Not today. Tomorrow. They needed time. Time to review whatever they had found. Time to build a strategy. Time to decide what to tell me. I typed a short response. I will think about it. Then I put the phone away. Later that evening, back at the hotel, I sat by the window watching rain slide down the glass. The parking lot lights reflected in the wet pavement below. My room remained quiet except for the occasional sound of passing traffic. Around 8 o'clock, my phone rang. Olivia. I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. Her voice sounded unusually warm. Helen, we have been worried about you. The sentence was so different from her recent behavior that it almost made me laugh. Almost. That is kind of you, I said. A brief silence followed. Then she moved quickly to the real reason for the call. We found some documents that might affect future decisions regarding the property. Property. Not family. Not grief. Not reconciliation. Property. The word told me everything. I looked out at the rain-covered parking lot and suddenly felt calmer than I had in weeks. Because for the first time, I understood exactly what they wanted. The question was whether they understood what I already knew. The next morning I woke earlier than usual. The rain had stopped during the night, leaving the world outside washed clean and quiet. Sunlight reflected off the wet pavement below my hotel window. For a few moments, I simply sat with a cup of coffee and watched people begin their day. A delivery truck pulled into the lot. A woman walked her dog along the sidewalk. Life continued as though nothing had changed. Yet everything had changed. Around 9 o'clock, Michael called. His voice was calm as always. I have reviewed a few additional records, he said. I thought you should know that there have been inquiries about listing the property. I stared out the window. Listing it for sale? Yes. The answer came gently. No formal listing yet, but there have been conversations. I thanked him and ended the call. Then I sat very still. Somehow hearing it confirmed aloud felt different from merely suspecting it. Jason and Olivia were not discussing possibilities anymore. They were making plans. Plans that depended on my absence. Plans that assumed I would quietly disappear. That afternoon, I drove past the house for the first time since leaving. I stayed across the street beneath a large oak tree where the branches were turning shades of orange and gold. The house looked exactly as it always had. The white porch railing. The flower beds Robert maintained so carefully. The blue shutters we painted together one summer after Jason left for college. Looking at it from a distance felt strange. Like visiting a place from someone else's memory. Then a black sedan pulled into the driveway. A man stepped out carrying a clipboard. A few minutes later, Olivia opened the front door and welcomed him inside. Even from across the street, I recognized the pattern. I had seen it before when neighbors sold their homes. The clipboard. The measuring tape. The careful walk around the property. I remained in my car and watched. Nearly an hour passed before the man finally left. As he drove away, another vehicle arrived. This time it was Jason. He stepped out holding a thick folder. The same manila folder I had seen days earlier. He disappeared into the house without looking around. I could have walked across the street. I could have confronted them. I could have demanded answers. Instead, I started the engine and drove away. They still believed I knew very little. There was value in that. That evening, my phone rang again. Jason. I answered after the second ring. Mom, he said. His tone sounded unusually friendly. Have you thought about meeting? A little. Good. There are some things we should discuss as a family. Family. The word felt carefully chosen. What things? I asked. A brief silence followed. Dad left some documents that may affect future decisions. I almost smiled. Future decisions. Another carefully selected phrase. Nobody wanted to say the real words. Ownership. Control. Money. I see, I replied. When would you like to meet? Relief entered his voice immediately. Saturday afternoon. That works for me. After we ended the call, I sat quietly in the hotel room. The meeting was finally coming. Whatever they believed they had found in Robert's files had given them confidence. They were moving forward. So was I? On the table beside me sat Robert's letter and copies of the property records Michael had provided. I looked at them for a long time. Then I carefully placed everything into a folder of my own. Saturday was only 2 days away, and for the first time since being forced out of my home, I felt completely prepared. Saturday arrived with clear skies and cool autumn air. I left the hotel shortly after noon and drove toward the house. Along the way, I passed familiar streets, familiar stores, familiar corners of the town where Robert and I had spent most of our lives. Nothing looked different, yet I felt different. For weeks, I had carried grief, confusion, and disappointment. Now those feelings had settled into something steadier. Clarity. When I pulled into the driveway, Jason opened the front door before I reached the porch. His smile appeared forced. Not hostile, not warm, careful. Behind him, Olivia stood in the entryway wearing a soft beige sweater and an expression I had never seen before. She looked nervous. The living room had changed since I left. Several framed photographs were missing from the mantel. New paint samples rested on the coffee table. A notebook filled with measurements sat beside them. They had already begun imagining a future without me. Thank you for coming, Jason said as we sat down. I nodded but said nothing. Olivia reached for the manila folder resting beside her. We found some documents among Robert's papers, she began. We thought it would be best if everyone reviewed them together. She slid several pages across the table. I recognized them immediately. Old tax records, insurance forms, maintenance receipts. Important documents perhaps, but nothing that changed ownership of anything. I watched carefully as Jason explained their significance. The more he spoke, the more obvious it became that they were building toward a conclusion. Finally, he leaned forward. Dad handled most financial matters. We just want to make sure everything is organized correctly moving forward. There it was again. Moving forward. Future decisions. Organized correctly. The language never changed. Direct statements were avoided. Assumptions were disguised as concerns. Olivia opened another section of the folder. There are also expenses associated with maintaining the property, she said. Property taxes, repairs, utilities. We think it would be overwhelming for one person. I almost smiled. 2 weeks earlier they had ordered me out. Now they were presenting arguments. The difference mattered. It meant uncertainty had entered the room. They no longer felt completely confident. Jason cleared his throat. Mom, if selling eventually becomes the best option, we could all benefit from planning early. Benefit. Another interesting word. I glanced around the room. My house. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the same windows that had illuminated decades of family gatherings. Birthday cakes, Christmas mornings, school celebrations, Robert sitting in his favorite chair reading the newspaper. None of those memories seemed present to Jason and Olivia. They saw square footage, market value, future opportunities. I saw a life. Is that why you asked me here? I asked quietly. Neither answered immediately. Olivia looked toward Jason. Jason looked toward the folder. Their silence lasted only a few seconds, but it revealed more than any explanation could. Then Olivia spoke. We found information that suggests decisions may need to be made soon. I folded my hands calmly in my lap. Interesting, I said, because I found some information too. The room immediately grew still. Jason's expression changed first, then Olivia's. Neither spoke. Outside, a breeze rustled the leaves of the maple tree near the front porch. Inside, the silence stretched between us. And for the first time since I walked out of the house, I realized they were no longer certain of anything. Jason stared at me across the coffee table. Olivia remained perfectly still beside him. Neither of them expected that answer. For several seconds the room was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock near the staircase. The same clock Robert's father had owned before him. The same clock that had marked every important moment in our family's history. I reached into my handbag and removed a folder. Nothing dramatic. No sudden movements. No raised voices. I simply placed it on the table between us. Jason looked at it first. Then Olivia. Neither reached for it. What information? Jason finally asked. His voice sounded cautious now. Careful. I opened the folder and slid the first document toward them. It was a certified property record from the county office. The seal was clearly visible in the corner. Olivia picked it up. Her eyes moved quickly across the page. Then more slowly. Then she stopped completely. The color drained from her face. Jason took the document from her hands and began reading for himself. I watched his expression change line by line. Confusion. Concern. Disbelief. What is this? He asked quietly. It is the ownership record for this house, I replied. No one spoke. Jason looked down again. His eyes returned to the names listed on the document. Robert Parker. Helen Parker. Joint owners. Equal ownership. Full survivorship rights. Every word sat plainly on the page. Impossible to misunderstand. Impossible to explain away. Olivia reached for the second document. This one included updated records filed after Robert's passing. The ownership transfer had occurred automatically. Legally. Properly. Completely. The house belonged to me. Not partly. Not temporarily. Entirely. A breeze drifted through the partially open window. Somewhere outside, a lawn mower hummed in the distance. The ordinary sounds felt strangely sharp in the silence. Finally, Jason lowered the papers. Dad never told me this. I know, I said. He did not tell me every detail either. Olivia swallowed hard. There must be some mistake. The statement sounded weak even to her own ears. I gently shook my head. Michael verified everything. The mention of our attorney seemed to land heavily. Jason leaned back against the couch. His shoulders sagged. For the first time since Robert's funeral, he looked less like a confident son making plans and more like a man realizing he had misunderstood something important. I opened the folder again and removed one final item. Robert's letter. I did not hand it to them. I simply placed it beside me. Your father wanted me protected, I said quietly. That was his priority. Jason stared at the letter but did not ask to read it. Perhaps he already knew enough. Perhaps he was afraid of what it might contain. Olivia looked around the room. At the walls. At the staircase. At the photographs that still remained. I could almost see her recalculating everything. Renovation plans. Real estate discussions. Future expectations. None of them rested on solid ground anymore. Then Jason spoke. Mom, why did you not tell us sooner? It was an interesting question. I folded my hands in my lap and looked at my son. Because I wanted to understand why you were so eager for me to leave before anyone checked the facts. Once again, silence filled the room. This time, neither Jason nor Olivia had an answer. Jason lowered his eyes to the documents scattered across the coffee table. Olivia sat motionless beside him. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was gone. In its place sat an uncomfortable silence. I did not enjoy seeing it. Contrary to what some people believe, there is very little satisfaction in watching your own family realize they have hurt you. There is only sadness. A different kind of sadness than grief, but sadness all the same. After several long moments, Jason finally spoke. Mom, I never wanted things to happen like this. I looked at him carefully. The little boy I raised seemed very far away. Not gone. Just buried beneath years of assumptions and influence and poor decisions. Then why did they happen? I asked quietly. He opened his mouth, but no answer came. Olivia stared at the floor. The grandfather clock continued its steady ticking from across the room. Time moved forward whether we were ready or not. Eventually, Olivia looked up. Her voice was softer than I had ever heard it. We thought we were helping. I nodded slowly. Helping whom? Once again, no answer followed. Outside, leaves drifted across the front lawn. Autumn had fully arrived. Robert always loved this season. He said it reminded him that endings were not failures. They were simply transitions. I thought about that as I looked around the room. The room where I had celebrated anniversaries. The room where Jason opened Christmas presents as a child. The room where Robert and I spent countless evenings talking about our future. A future that now belonged only to memory. I gathered the documents and returned them to my folder. Then I stood. Both Jason and Olivia immediately looked up. Neither knew what I was about to say. Neither knew what I wanted. The truth was that I had spent many sleepless nights asking myself the same question. Anger would have been easy. Revenge would have been easy. But Robert had spent his life building this family. I refused to spend mine destroying it. I am moving back into the house next week, I said calmly. Neither objected. This is my home. It will remain my home. Jason nodded slowly. Of course. I continued. You are both adults. You can make your own decisions. But from this point forward, every decision involving this property will be made with complete honesty and complete transparency. Olivia quietly agreed. The conversation ended shortly afterward. There were no dramatic arguments. No shouting. No grand speeches. Just reality settling into place. As I walked toward the front door, I paused beside the family photographs on the wall. One picture showed Jason at age 10 standing between Robert and me after a Little League game. All three of us were smiling. I touched the edge of the frame for a moment before stepping outside. A week later, I returned home. Not as a guest. Not as an obligation. As the owner. As the woman who had helped build it. The house felt different when I unlocked the front door. Not because the walls had changed. Not because the rooms were larger. It felt different because fear was gone. I walked into the living room and set my suitcase beside Robert's favorite chair. Sunlight streamed through the windows exactly as it always had. The air smelled faintly of cedar and old books. Home. Real home. I stood there for a long time, listening to the quiet. Then I smiled. They had spent weeks trying to convince me that I no longer belonged there. In the end, the truth had spoken louder than any argument. And for the first time since losing Robert, I felt something I thought grief had taken forever. Peace.